For a warrior of his tradition, the sword was not a weapon. It was his soul made steel. It carried the spirit of his ancestors, the honor of his family, the very essence of who he was as a man and a fighter. To surrender it was to surrender something far deeper than a blade. And so, when the moment of defeat came, the Japanese general hoped perhaps that he might keep it, that this one sacred thing might be left to him. But the American commander who stood across from him understood the meaning of that sword perfectly. He understood it so well that he knew exactly why it could not be kept. The taking of the sword was not cruelty. It was the most precise possible statement of what surrender truly meant. This is a story about symbols and about the profound power they hold over the human heart. It is a story about the rituals of defeat and victory, about the deep meaning embedded in objects and ceremonies, and about a moment when two cultures, two warrior traditions, met at the point of a surrendered blade. And it touches on General Douglas MacArthur, one of the towering and most complex figures of the war in the Pacific, a man with a deep sense of history and an instinct for the symbolic weight of great moments. To understand why the surrender of a sword carried such enormous significance, you have to understand what the sword meant in the military tradition of the defeated nation. For the warrior class of Japan, stretching back across centuries, the sword was the most sacred of all possessions. It was bound up with a code of honor, with the identity of the warrior, with concepts of duty and spirit that went to the very core of a fighting man's being. A military officer's sword was not merely a tool or even merely a weapon. It was a symbol of his status, his honor, and his soul. To carry it was to carry the weight of a proud tradition. To lose it was to lose something that could not be measured in material terms. This reverence for the sword had carried into the modern era and into the military of the time. Officers wore swords as marks of their rank and their connection to the warrior tradition. The blade represented their authority, their honor, and their identity as members of a martial elite. And this meant that in the context of surrender, the sword took on a special and almost unbearable significance. To hand over one's sword was the ultimate acknowledgement of defeat, the surrender not just of a weapon, but of one's honor, one's status, one's very identity as a warrior. It was, in the deepest sense, the most personal and painful act of submission a military officer could perform. The victors understood this. And here, we should be honest about the history, because the surrender ceremonies that ended the war in the Pacific were real, solemn, and carefully designed. And the surrender of swords was a genuine and meaningful part of how that war concluded. What follows is a retelling grounded in the real practice of sword surrender and the documented importance of these rituals, told as a narrative to convey their full meaning. The core is true. The surrender of the war in the Pacific genuinely involved the ceremonial surrender of swords by defeated officers, and this act carried exactly the profound symbolic weight we are describing. The details are recounted to illuminate why these ceremonies mattered so deeply. Picture the scene of such a surrender. A defeated officer, a man who had perhaps spent his entire life in service to a martial code, who had risen through the ranks, who had commanded men in battle, now standing before his conquerors. And the moment comes when he must give up his sword. For a man steeped in the warrior tradition, this was an act of almost spiritual magnitude. The sword that had symbolized everything he was, that connected him to the honor of his ancestors and the pride of his nation, was to be taken from his hands and placed in the possession of his enemy. It was the physical embodiment of total defeat, made concrete and undeniable in the surrender of that single, sacred object. Now imagine the hope that some of these officers may have harbored, the wish that they might somehow be allowed to retain this most precious possession. Perhaps they hoped that the victors would not understand its significance, or that some accommodation might be made, some gesture of respect that would leave them their blade, and thus a fragment of their honor. To keep the sword would have been to preserve something essential, to soften the totality of the defeat, to retain a thread of the identity that surrender otherwise stripped away. It was a deeply human hope, the wish to hold on to the one thing that mattered most, even in the moment of losing everything else. But the American commander understood the meaning of the sword far too well to permit this, and his refusal to allow it was not born of cruelty or a desire to humiliate. It was born of a precise understanding of what surrender had to accomplish. The whole purpose of the surrender ritual was to make the defeat complete, unmistakable, and real, both to the defeated and to the world. And because the sword was the very symbol of a warrior's honor and identity, the surrender of that sword was the most powerful possible expression of the completeness of the defeat. To allow the officer to keep his blade would have been to leave the defeat incomplete, to permit the preservation of exactly the thing that surrender was meant to relinquish. This is the profound logic at the heart of the moment. The taking of the sword was meaningful precisely because the sword was meaningful. If the blade had been just a piece of metal, taking it would have meant nothing. But because it carried the weight of honor, tradition, and identity, its surrender carried that same weight. The commander, by insisting on the surrender of the sword, was insisting on the full reality of the defeat, on the complete acknowledgement that the war was lost and that the old order of things had ended. He understood that to be merciful with the symbol would be to be false about the substance. There is a deep wisdom in recognizing the power of symbols this way, and the best leaders throughout history have understood it. Human beings are not moved by facts alone. We are moved by meaning, by ritual, by the symbolic representation of great truths. A surrender that existed only on paper in the dry language of documents would not have penetrated the heart the way the surrender of a sword did. The ceremony, the ritual, the handing over of the sacred blade made the abstract reality of defeat into something concrete and emotionally undeniable. The commander grasped that to truly end the war, to make the defeat real in the hearts of the defeated, required not just signatures, but symbols. Consider, too, the respect that was paradoxically embedded in this act. By taking the sword so seriously, by understanding its profound significance, the victors were in a sense acknowledging the depth of the tradition they had defeated. They were not treating the sword as a trivial trinket to be casually confiscated. They were treating it as the sacred object it was, and in doing so, they were recognizing the warrior culture of their enemy, even as they required its submission. There is a strange dignity in this, a recognition that the defeated had a proud tradition worthy of being taken seriously, even in the moment of its defeat. The gravity of the ceremony honored the very thing it required to be surrendered. The surrender of swords also served a crucial purpose for the future, for the building of peace. By making the defeat complete and unmistakable, these rituals helped to close the chapter of the war definitively. There could be no ambiguity, no lingering belief that the defeat was partial or negotiable, no comfortable fiction that honor had been preserved. The warrior who surrendered his sword surrendered also the illusion that the old order might somehow continue. This completeness was essential for the transformation that would follow, for the rebuilding of a defeated nation into something new. The total nature of the defeat, symbolized by the surrendered blade, cleared the ground for a genuine new beginning. It is worth reflecting on the emotional reality of these moments for the men who lived through them, because behind the historical significance were real human beings experiencing profound loss. For the defeated officers, the surrender of their swords was a moment of deep personal anguish. These were men whose entire sense of self had been built on the warrior code, on the honor that the sword represented. To give it up was to experience a kind of death, the death of the identity they had carried their whole lives. There is genuine tragedy in this, the tragedy of proud men brought low, of a way of life ending, of individuals forced to surrender the symbol of everything they had believed themselves to be. We can recognize the necessity of their defeat while still acknowledging the human pain within it. At the same time, there is a larger meaning that transcends the individual anguish. The warrior tradition that the sword represented had, in this era, been bound up with a path of aggression and conquest that had brought immense suffering to many nations, and ultimately to Japan itself. The surrender of the swords marked the end of that destructive path, the closing of an era of militarism that had led to catastrophe. In this sense, the taking of the swords was not just the defeat of individuals, but the defeat of a whole direction a nation had taken, the symbolic end of a militaristic order that had caused so much devastation. From the ashes of that defeat, a different and more peaceful future could be built. There is a profound lesson here about the relationship between symbols and reality. one that applies far beyond the surrender ceremonies of a long-ago war. Symbols matter because they make abstract truths tangible and emotionally real. A leader who understands the power of symbols can use them to communicate meaning far more powerfully than words alone. The commander who insisted on the surrender of the sword understood that the symbol and the substance were inseparable, that to make the defeat real required engaging with the deepest symbolic meanings held by the defeated. This is a kind of wisdom that goes beyond mere tactics or strategy. It is an understanding of the human heart and what moves it. Consider the contrast between two ways the surrender might have been handled. One way would have been purely administrative, a matter of signing documents and processing the defeated according to procedure, with no attention to symbol or ceremony. The other way, the way that was actually chosen, recognized the profound importance of ritual and symbol, of making the defeat real through meaningful ceremony. The second way was immeasurably more powerful because it spoke to the heart and not just the mind. It is a reminder that in moments of great historical significance, the symbolic dimension is not mere decoration. It is essential to the meaning of the event itself. By insisting on the surrender of the sword, the commander was also making a statement about the nature of the victory and the values it represented. The war had been fought not just for territory or power, but for a vision of the world, and the defeat of the aggressive militarism symbolized by the warrior's sword was part of the larger victory of that vision. The surrendered blade represented the triumph of one order over another, the end of a path of conquest, and the beginning of a different way. The ceremony was, in this sense, a statement of what the war had been about and what its conclusion meant for the future of the world. What makes this story endure is the way it captures the deep human truth that meaning lives in symbols. We are creatures who invest objects and rituals with profound significance, who find in a sword or a flag or a ceremony the embodiment of our deepest values and identities. The surrender of the sword was so powerful precisely because it engaged this fundamental aspect of human nature, because it took a sacred symbol and made its surrender the embodiment of total defeat. The commander who understood this understood something essential about people, about war, and about how the great transitions of history are made real in the hearts of those who live through them. By the time the surrender ceremonies were complete and the swords had been handed over, the war in the Pacific had reached its definitive symbolic end. The blades that had represented the honor and identity of a warrior tradition now lay in the hands of the victors, and in that transfer was embodied the complete reality of a defeat that would reshape a nation and a region. The era of militarism that the swords represented had ended, and from its ending, a new and more peaceful future could begin to take shape. So remember the warrior and his sacred sword, the blade that carried his soul and the honor of his ancestors, and the moment when he had to surrender it to his conqueror. Remember the commander who understood the meaning of that sword too well to let it be kept, who knew that the completeness of the defeat required the surrender of the very symbol of honor. And remember the deep truth the moment reveals, that symbols hold extraordinary power over the human heart. That meaning lives in the objects and rituals we hold sacred, and that the great turning points of history are made real not only in documents and declarations, but in the surrender of a single sacred blade.